Good evening, everyone. This is Jay Simmons, president of Mach 30, and this is our 2014 ISPCS review. For the last 7 years, Greg and I, in various combinations, have gone down to Las Cruces, New Mexico, for the International Symposium on Personal and Commercial Spaceflight, and where we met David Valentine. Unfortunately, this year we couldn't go, but David still did, and so he's going to join us tonight and tell us about all the cool things that happened at the conference this week and the news out of the new space movement. And for those of you that are not familiar with us, we are Mach 30, a nonprofit here in the U.S. dedicated to hastening the advancement of humanity into a spacefaring civilization. I want to encourage you to check us out at mach30.org. That's MACH30.org. And I want to thank everyone for coming. And so let me introduce Greg Moran, our vice president.
Howdy.
And our special guest, David Valentine, the anthropologist studying the new space movement, who has been able to go to ISPCS this year when we couldn't. Thank you.
Hi there.
So we're starting off by recognizing the balcony that David's sitting at. That's
Yes.
very familiar. And
So yeah,
I'm missing it.
yeah, it's very, very, very lovely out here. It's warmer than actually usual. You know how it's usually a little bit of a nip in the air at this time of the year. It's been unusually warm. So yeah. I assume you have questions for me, Jay or Greg?
Yeah, I mean, this was the 10th anniversary year, right, for ISPCS?
Yep.
How did all that go down? How was Pat's celebration of the 10th anniversary?
It went very well. It was actually. Are you getting an echo on the line?
A little bit, but it's okay.
Okay, all right. So it was billed as the power of 10, right? So the emphasis was, I think, more on the question of power than, and the sort of working the idea of the logarithm, right, or the exponentialness of the power of 10. There was very little said about what marked that, what was the real anxiety around that 10, which is Virgin Galactic not having flown yet, which I was expecting to hear a lot more of. And at the end of last year's conference, you may remember that Mike Simpson from the Secure World Foundation was the last speaker, as he was this year actually, and said something to the tune of, if Virgin Galactic isn't flying this time next year, there'll be a lot of questions, a lot of anxiety. So it's kind of an acid test. But I was speaking to him more informally during the course of the day, today or yesterday. And asked him about that. I said, this is actually my, as you both know, my last major field trip for this research project. And it was in part, I came because I'm very interested in cycles of time and people's thoughts about temporality and the passage of time. And so that's why I came, was in a sense that that challenge that Mike Simpson threw down. But what he said, and what I've really experienced, is that people are incredibly patient, right? That they do realize that things are complicated and things change and plans don't go according to plan. And so in some ways, the tone was very much like similar ISPCSs, where, it's just around the corner, we should be flying next year, within the next 6 to X number of months, right? I think that Virgin Galactic's I don't want to say failure to fly, but the fact that they haven't flown yet is in part offset by other successes in the broader industry. So clearly, the award of the commercial crew, the commercial crew awards last 2 weeks ago. Was a big thing. There was actually a very interesting panel, which I'll tell you about, that had John Mulholland from Boeing, Barry, I forget, I've actually got the notes here. I should get his name, from SpaceX, Barry Matsumori.
Before you move on to that panel, I was wondering about the milestones you were talking about. Did they mention the flight test program for Virgin's Spaceship 2? Because they've had some recent successes with test flights.
Yeah. No, they definitely talked about that when George Whitesides was talking talking. He did some. I've actually copied down some of his language because there were a couple of very sensitive things at this conference. One was Virgin Galactic has not yet flown. The other one was the fact that Sierra Nevada was not awarded.
I was just going to ask about Sierra Nevada.
Right.
That was, they there? Were they there this week?
Yes, and they were on this panel I was just telling you about. So it was on this panel was Matsumori from SpaceX, Mulholland from Boeing, and Mark Sarangelo from Sierra Nevada. So very interesting. So these were the two sort of unspeakables or unsayables of this conference. So what if I just can get to my notes on Whitesides, I mean, he said sort of right at the end of his. He said, personally, I'm excited about the next 6 months. And then he said the next year is one people will remember for a long time. So that's the closest he comes to talking about a timeline. There were several kind of snarky comments on Twitter, which I've been following alongside, especially as you might imagine from NASA Watch. And a couple of other people, but yeah, on the whole, it was he was. That's as much as he said, and people didn't ask questions about it. In fact, there's a new presentation form they have this year called the. It's a short 10-minute presentation, so there were a lot of presentations, and they were not given. Those people were not given Q&A time, so he did not have to suffer the Q&A from the audience about that. But then in the panel I was just telling you about, the commercial crew panel, which was moderated by Jeff Faust, who's actually just gotten a position in Space News.
Oh, cool. Good for him.
He said right at the beginning, we are there's certain kinds of there's a geo protest in at the moment. There's these participants can't talk about that. It's not going to talk about that at all. And what we're actually going to do is talk about other commercial possibilities in space that are facilitated by the commercial, this commercial crew agreement with NASA. So both of these issues were worked around, and but that was kind of subtext for a lot of the anxiety that was at the conference. But it's a very place in when I first started coming here in 2009, where I think at that point there had not been a successful SpaceX launch.
No,
right?
I don't think so.
No, Constellation had just been planned, had just been cancelled. The Augustine Commission, I think, maybe had just put out their executive summary for their report. There were a lot of big questions. COTS was still, COTS was still in progress. There was nothing like being, there was no Spaceport America yet. There was no Hangout there. They'd gone through all the planning stages, but there was no. So 5 years later, there's a lot more that's been built. There's stuff that's been flown, and I think to sort of circle back to my original point, the patience that Mike Simpson from the Secure World Foundation was talking about is in part it's not just patience per se, but it's patience that is kind of has been tempered by some successes in other domains of the industry. And I would also say at the same time, when because I ask people about this as part of my job, is to find out about how people are feeling about the future, right? And so equally frustrated, people are still. I spoke to one woman, an engineer, who said, in my 20s when I started in this field, they promised us. I said, this is just around the corner, and now as I'm moving to retirement, I don't think that this is going to happen. By this, I think she means a permanent human presence in space, before I'm not here to see it, basically. So there's many different kinds of temporalities, right? So there's the very short-term one of when will Virgin Galactic now fly, now that they have a craft, now that they appear to have solved the engine problem, now that they appear to be going back into powered test flights. There's the sort of medium term of, SpaceX and Boeing and Bigelow putting up their beam component on the space station next year, and lots of other smaller successes along the way. But then this very long-term question of which only really SpaceX is talking about in any kind of serious way, which is going to some other place in the cosmos.
Yep.
So,
well, and which gets back to our language and our mission about it being a spacefaring civilization. That's really what the end goal is, and that the hope is to make that come about sooner rather than later, to bring the time scale back closer to us than let it meander on.
Right.
And from the times that I've gone, I've noticed that ISPCS tends to be a more visionary conference. I've been to a lot of space conferences that are really focused on the here and the now, which capabilities, which companies are launching, what's their flight rates, what's their manifest. And Pat usually does a really good balance between that tactical level, current events process and a little bit of long-term visioning, futuristic planning, more of a strategic, where is the industry going in this next couple years and the decade kind of.
Yeah. No, she's so one of the interesting things, how she always has some musical entertainment to start off day one. This year it was an opera. There is an opera, a new wave opera that's being written based on a picture book written by Umberto Eco, the great Italian semiotician and novelist, called the Three Astronauts. And that opera itself had been in part inspired by the writer of the opera, having attended ISPCS the previous year, to get some sense of the industry and to get contacts and so on. So they had like this sort of showcase from the opera with three of the three main performers singing in Russian, English, and Chinese, and not the Martian. Apparently there is a Martian as well. Actually, there's a whole story about the Martian language, but I won't go there. So there's a sense in which it's a lot. Even the musical entertainment felt like it was more advanced. If you know what I mean. It was about space now, rather than just being a local band or something, or so it felt like there were signs of the kind of maturing of the conference. A lot of enormous praise for Pat and the work that she does to bring these kinds of conferences together.
Absolutely. That's definitely, it was not a year to miss, Greg.
Sorry, guys. Yeah. So I'm just so I'm sure you.
We lost your audio there. Try again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I said I'm sure you have questions for me. And what's the lighting like, by the way? Because I'm sitting outside and there is a light right behind me. Do you want me to move?
We actually see your face pretty well. You're in a pretty dark area, but we see your face reasonably well. It'll be all right.
Okay.
It's proof that you are at ISPCS.
So I was saying I have I could go through some of my notes and the agenda. I'm trying to, I'm also brain fried. I've got 60 pages of notes after 2 days, so I'm not sure that I'm going to remember everything. So probably questions that you ask will, key me into stuff.
Sure, absolutely. One of my questions is about is there going to be a tour tomorrow? For the last I don't know, like 3 or 4 or 5 years, there's going to. Okay, cool.
Yes,
cool.
And I'm
any word on what I'll be there?
No word at all. As you know, there's always been this kind of like separation between the tour and the conference, and you kind of have to scramble around to find information about the tour when it's leaving. It's never particularly well organized, unlike the conference itself. I'm going. I'm doing my ethnographic duty. I do know for the first time ever that they have open seats. They had open seats on it today, so I think that that was an interesting little datum. You know, it's not sold out. I think a lot of people have been up there, they've seen it, and now they're kind of waiting for something to happen from it. I'm going up, as I said, to do my ethnographic duty as an anthropologist and keep on returning.
Yeah.
And,
as a reminder for anyone who watches the video, the tour we're talking about is at Spaceport America, and David and I had gone to a bunch. Like, we were there when it was dirt, when the runway was graded clay, and we walked on the runway pre-concrete. We've walked on the runway with concrete. We last year, Greg and David and I all went and got to see inside Mach not only the operations facility, but also we got a small quick tour inside the part of the actual hangar facility where Virgin's going to be operating out of before they did their fit out, which was a big surprise.
Specifically, the area that will become the visitor's experience for the folks who are not astronauts or space visitors, whatever the terminology is.
Spaceflight participants, I think.
Yes, there you go. Yeah. And that is really surprising, David, that there are seats left. It's been a thing where, even though it was not well advertised, it was usually very popular in terms of the amount of seats that were available were basically taken in the early years, completely taken, and then some. And even after that, usually whatever number of buses they had decided to tote out, we were full up.
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
Well, I mean, it may have filled today, you know, but they did announce that there were seats available during the conference today. Yeah. So so I'm going up there tomorrow. And looking forward, you know, I don't expect to see too much different because it was pretty much done last year, right? There wasn't very much left to be done, though. I think in the operations center they had a bit of, you know, what do they call it, drywall to put up and whatnot, bit of painting, but it was essentially done.
But they had the fire trucks. We got to climb
on. Oh yes, brand new fire trucks, and so I don't imagine much more than that. So we'll see. I was told, and by someone, that there's going to be this year, for the first time, a requirement to sign a release promising that you won't use the photographs that you take for commercial purposes.
Interesting.
I don't know if that's true or not. I can let you know, but that's that's you know, scuttlebutt.
Yeah. Excellent.
Yeah.
I love the inside scoop. That probably means that Virgin has started putting up some of their advertising marketing materials and
it could be
showy, high gloss images of the craft.
Yeah. Yep.
One thing that I've noticed we've never got to see every time we've gone out there is all of the operational sites, because they have been running other launches off the facility for several years. We never go out to those pads.
We used to, Greg. We used to. Before the stock existed, in order, I think partly because that's where stuff was happening, that was stuff they could show off. They did take, in fact, John and I have pictures, I think, of the three of us, you, me, and him, and me and David, on the fake lunar pads from the Northrop Grumman Lunar Lander Challenge.
Yeah.
And I've got pictures of the vertical launch rail from is it Up Aerospace, I think?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I missed all of those earlier tours. I started later, and
but they haven't lately gone out, and that is where all the exciting stuff is happening really right now.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of activity actually on the especially with Up Aerospace. I think I heard that they're about to have their 100th launch from there.
Wow, that's exciting.
Yeah.
That's a power of 10.
Yeah, there you go. Well, and actually, so go back to the power of 10. That was interesting, the way that different people worked that into their, into their talk in one way or another. So people did, people were quite obedient and did that work of talking about whether it was the figure of 10 or the figure of power or the idea of exponentialness, or whether it was, thinking about 20 as opposed to 10. or thinking about, you know, exponential functions, or, you know, whatever it might be. A lot of speakers actually did that work. And as I said, you know, people really love this conference. You know, it's very much feels like, more than any of the other conferences, even the more grassroots ones like Space Access or ISDC or New Space, I think, people, I think in part because it's so well staged. You know, it's in this in this environment, the Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum, which kind of metaphorically enacts the, you know, the theme of the conference, especially for an American audience, right? And and also because it's very well organized, and, you know, there's good food.
Pat feeds us very well at that conference.
You come out well fed for your $800. So that power of 10 was, I would say, pervasive throughout most of the presentations. There were a lot of presentations. I record each presentation. As you know, I have 19 from yesterday, and today I missed a whole bunch because I got into some interesting conversations outside of the conference, and there were some I didn't feel I needed to see. But, you know, 19 separate presentations is a lot, and some of them, you know, as I said, they've moved to this 10-minute format. Spotlight talks is what they call them. Okay. So you know, there were a lot of speakers, a lot of different things covered, a lot of you know, most of the major new space companies. Jeff Grayson was there, George Whitesides was there. You had Mach Sarangelo, you had you know, John Mulholland, this Barry Matsumori guy was the most senior person from SpaceX. There was Sean Mahoney from Maston. I'm just trying to think who else now. As I should go back to the.
That is. I got another question for you.
What's that? Sorry.
So I was thinking back to last year, and the feeling that Jay and I got from our attendance was that they were shifting towards the corporate.
Hold on, there's a car or something.
Yeah, it's just gone by.
Go ahead, Greg.
So it felt like they were shifting more towards the commercial side or corporate side of space, and since the conference is ISPCS for both personal and commercial, was there any more feeling of more personal kinds of space, or how did they relate that to? Was there any feeling of that?
Well, I guess it means. The question is what you mean by personal, right? So by personal, you mean sort of suborbital, which is the kind of immediate likelihood of non-military, non-government people going to space,
exactly.
even if they are really well-heeled people. Then yes, there's plenty of that. You know, there was presentations from three spaceports at least: Spaceport America, Spaceport Sweden, Mojave. Oh, and then
Sweden was back. So I think Sweden skipped a year or something like that.
Yeah, Sweden was back, and then Kennedy, you know, which is now billing itself as a spaceport, was, you know, presentations, as I said, several presentations from people at Xcore and Virgin Galactic, but also Maston, which is not, you know, in the business of carrying people. Blue Origin was present in the form of a master moderator for the second day, Ariane Cornell. But they did not, as far as I remember, have somebody presenting. You know, they're very close to the chest organization.
Yeah.
But you did have also ULA, Arianespace, you know, Boeing, not ATK, but who have I missed? Did I say SpaceX? So some of the big orbital providers or wannabe providers, so there was so I guess it depends on how, you know, if you're dividing it orbital, suborbital, if you're dividing it, you know, small guy, big guy, if you're dividing it new space, old space, if you're dividing it, like have a rocket, don't have a rocket. You know, the depending on how you carve it, there was a little bit of everybody there.
It sounds like it was better attended in terms of spread than last year. Like last year felt a lot narrower group of operational and near operational companies.
Yeah, I think had I spoken to you on Tuesday before going to the conference, I would have a memory of last year. Now it's completely been wiped out by this year. You know,
Sure.
I'd have to go back and look at my notes. I remember feeling satisfied at the end of last year's conference, which I didn't feel at the end of this conference. And in part, you know, to the extent that I'm both a space geek and a social critic, right, a critical thinker about the field of space. You know, I enjoyed it. My space geek self enjoyed it, and my critical social scientist enjoyed it simultaneously. So there were also presentations from actually a small company called Worldview, which is have you heard of this thing, Greg?
Yes.
Yeah, balloon.
Satellite.
No, it's a balloon.
Okay.
Like
Oh, is this the crewed high altitude balloon flights?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I have heard of this. They're like
Yes.
what, like 50,000 or something like that for a
lower price point of 75K.
There you go. Yeah. Versus the 99 or 250.
Yeah.
Depending on if you're talking about X-Core or
I think the score is 90, right?
99, I think.
Oh, they put it up.
I thought it was always 99. It might be 90. I might just not remember correctly.
I thought it was 90. Anyway, but yeah, so they had you know, this is the new I guess a newish venture by Jane Poynter and Tabor McCullum who were the old, you know, the Biosphere people, Biosphere 2 people.
Yeah.
Okay.
Who have who've got this company. They do enclosed life support system stuff.
Okay.
I forget what they're called off the top of my head, but so they had a young, you know, a young thing presenting. He you know, 23-year-old kid who was talking about the that project. As I said, a lot of spaceports. Stu Witt from Mojave Spaceport. So a lot of George Sowers from ULA, Clay Mowry from Arianespace. I'm just going. Let me just see. I feel like I'm doing this piecemeal. I'm through the. And then a bunch of NASA people, of course. Bill Gerstenmaier, who was supposed to come last year, but if you remember, last year we were right in the middle of the government shutdown.
Yes.
So
Yes,
all the NASA people couldn't come, right?
Huge effect.
Yes.
Much beyond NASA, there was lots of corporate shuffling as well, as folks were not able to travel or budgets did not allow.
Yep, and a lot of the military folks that usually would show up were also not there last year.
I saw Paul Damphus there, who, you know, is ex Air Force, I think, and for a while the executive director of National Space Society. I saw him briefly. He didn't present. I just realized I'm looking at the agenda. I lied. Brett Alexander Origin actually did one of these spotlight talks, so that was a lie. There was someone from Blue Origin there, but there was somebody from DoD, and my battery is about to go out, so I'm going to go inside and take you with me because I need to plug in. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Again, it's live from in the field. I mean, it doesn't get any more real than this.
Yeah, it's true. And
so at night, out on the patio.
Okay.
So one of the things that I was curious about, because for the last several years, export control, specifically ITAR and ITAR reform, has been a panel. Did they that come up again this year? Interesting.
It was hardly mentioned. Give me 1 second. I just got to get my charger.
Oh, that's interesting that they didn't mention the elephant in the room, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, it's always been one of my Greg, you and I talk about this from time to time. It's always been one of my observations that when they bring up export controls, you've got the really big companies that are like, well, that's not a problem. You just bring your army of lawyers. And the really small companies are like, that's the scariest monster we've ever seen.
Yeah. I think for ITAR, a few things that were said. I mean, there wasn't a panel, unless it was one that I missed because I was having a conversation, but I don't remember seeing anything on ITAR. There was an interesting, so what I will say about ITAR is when it was mentioned almost with the sense that it's going to be taken care of, right? That at this point, Sierra Nevada has just signed these agreements, whatever they are, right? With this plan to sell essentially a space program package to sovereign nations. Right. There's been all kinds of maneuvers to try and deal with ITAR, like wet leasing, like what XCOR has done with wet leasing, and so on. So I think there's a sense that because the industry, that there's this acknowledgement that there are commercial companies that are going to be flying American astronauts to the International Space Station, right? And that, I think my sense was that people were really feeling as if, as this industry is becoming a reality, the regulations are going to have to respond in one way or another. So, I mean, I don't know, but there didn't seem to be the kind of ongoing, discussion about how awful ITAR was as there usually is. That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. I actually need to write about it. I need to write that down. ITAR.
If my memory serves, the reform for the EAR was very new last year, and so at this point it's been around for a while, and folks have probably had some time to adjust and evaluate how the new regulations either do or don't apply to their companies. So it's more of a steady state than it was last year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So going back through the agenda again, so the ITAR leads me into this discussion with this fellow Doug Lavero, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy from DoD. So cool. I've never seen a DoD person present here before that I can remember, and he was essentially making the the military always freaks me out. I'm sorry, Greg, but it always does.
No worries, no worries.
But he was talking about the kinds of challenges that the Defense Department faces, where companies come to them and say, they want to sell satellite data imagery that has 0.25 meter resolution, and what do you do with that, right? And so, but he suggested that actually the best solution was not to suppress it, but to allow it to happen, and then kind of think of it as an opportunity rather than a problem. But I thought that was interesting. We had someone, Mark Kinnersley, talking from Astrium North America. CASIS. We had a presentation from CASIS.
Yep, they're the company that's managing the International Space Station.
Right.
The National Laboratory.
Right.
Management arm, nonprofit.
Mm-hmm. Nonprofit, yes.
Not company. It's an NG. And it's a public-private partnership, if I remember correctly, because it's a national. It's basically they're treating ISS like a national lab at this point in terms of the scientific side. The space operational, don't let it fall out of the sky and don't let the power stop and things like that. It's still a very NASA program, but all the lab stuff is now moving over to CASIS.
Right. And then there were a couple that I missed. There was John Shannon talking about. No, I did see this one talking about Boeing's role in supporting ISS. I did miss the next one. Kevin Heath from Waypoint to Space. And then there was a panel about entrepreneurship. Led by, it was sort of moderated by Jason Cruson, who's from the NASA, what are they called, HEOMOD, the Human Exploration and Operations Mission Directorate. And the panelists there were Bob Richards from Moon Express, Sean Mahoney from Maston, and Chris Boshuizen from Planet Labs. And then there was an anthropologist who wasn't me.
What?
Actually, yeah, an archaeologist actually talking about trying to figure out heritage issues with sites on the moon that have, space heritage. And the site she's particularly concerned about is Tranquility Base, the landing site for Apollo 11. And then there was a presentation from James van der Plug, who's the Chief Medical Officer for Virgin Galactic, who basically was saying, we've done a lot of experiments. It looks like you'd be good to go to space unless you have a really serious health problem. Yeah, fine, you can go. And then Will Pomerantz gave a 10-minute rocket ship tour through his experience with incentivizing prizes. He's from Virgin Galactic. And then this young fellow who stood in for Jane Poynter from Worldview Enterprises. We had the banquet, which was good. This is the only conference I've ever been to where the banquet food is actually decent. And so that was yesterday. Then this morning, George Neild opened up. Oh no, actually it was the opening with the mayor, which always happens on the second day. Then George Neild from the FAA AST. Oh no, he's actually from FAA AST, and as usual, gave his historical analogy. He always has a historical analogy every time. Jeff Grayson gave a great talk called "Captains of Our Fate," where he basically argued that what he's been arguing before. We need to increase flight rates. Then there was a very interesting presentation from Jeff Sponable and Tom Ingersoll. Tom Ingersoll is now head of Skybox Imaging, and Jeff Sponable is now with DARPA, but they both had worked on the DCX.
Yep.
And so there was this kind of retrospective look at the DCX, the DCX, and that sort of led into a discussion of the XS-1, which is a new experimental space plane that DARPA is working on, which kind of looks like it. I don't know. It kind of looks like it might be something like the Skylon. I don't know. I'm as you know, I'm not enough of a tech head to understand similarities or differences between these things.
So speaking of
interesting
space planes, the X-37 is. Did the X-37 get any mention? She's getting ready to come down after a 2-year mission.
Yeah, so there were several mentions that during the day people were talking about the X-37. They were talking about the upcoming comet that's flying by Mars. There was talk of the spacewalk, the EVA that was happening at the ISS as during our lunch on I think the Tuesday or the Wednesday. So there was a lot of that kind of linking of what's going on out there to what was going on down here.
That's fun. I always like that aspect of making space accessible, and they think they do a good job there.
Yeah.
So, David, I don't know if we want to cut you off, but I want to be cognizant of your evening commitments tonight.
Oh yeah, well I'm just waiting for a phone call, so I'm happy to keep on talking.
Okay.
So, real quick, one of the other questions I had was, what was the most surprising bit of news you heard? There's usually one or two pieces that haven't leaked out yet, in my experience, and everyone's like, "Oh, wow!" and it's the big surprise. Were there big surprises this year, and if so, what was it?
I'll tell you, the biggest surprise for me was that Jeff Grayson not only knew who I was, but he downloaded one of my papers to read. That was my biggest personal surprise.
Nice.
I nearly fell off my, I fell down. I never expect any of these people to know who I am, but I suppose I've been hanging around for 5 years now. It's probably leaked out. I would say I actually can't think of what the big surprising announcement was. There was nothing that was really talked of in those terms. I think what people were waiting to see was what this panel would be like between Sierra Nevada, Boeing, and
SpaceX.
Oh yeah, that one, SpaceX, and
just the big one.
Yeah, and the question about Virgin Galactic when they're going to fly, but I don't recall, and there probably is one, and I'm just too brain dead to remember it at this point, and I'll have to email you. And I learned some very interesting things about gravity, actually, which is what I want to write about next. About the difference between Newtonian and Einsteinian understandings of gravity. I'm just trying to think. Do you want me to continue going through the agenda?
Sure. For as long as you have. I mean, we'd love to have you for more, as long as you're available.
Yeah. So there was another presentation about this this new space plane from DARPA, from Doug Young from Northrop Grumman. Sean Mahoney talking.
Real quick, just out of curiosity, did he say? Do you know which division of Northrop was he from? Space or
it
from?
It says here Missile Defense and Advanced Missions.
Okay.
Northrop Grumman Aerospace Systems.
Sean Mahoney. Northrop Grumman Aerospace Systems. Okay, so he's from the folks out in LA. Cool.
Yeah, you know that stuff. I don't.
That's why I was asking.
Right. Sean Mahoney gave something called Faster Horses in a Field of Dreams. Will Hampton from Boeing gave a talk, which the title of which I am convinced has been at every single space conference I've ever been to, which is "The Time Is Now."
Yeah.
And then there were a bunch that I missed, just because. In fact, I think I missed that one because I needed to,
Well, you've heard it before.
On my head. Yeah, there was stuff about the Flight Opportunities Program, something from Christine Anderson about Spaceport America. There was one from Kennedy Space Center and its transformation to a multi-use spaceport. Something about, let's see, this was someone from the U.S.
So hold on there for just a second, David. Have you been back to Kennedy Space Center in the last year or so since they got Atlantis and have started that kind of transition? I actually went with Maureen as a little part of a 3-day getaway between the end of school and the mass frantic go back to work and all that. And the Atlantis experience and just the general feel of how they're presenting Kennedy is very different than it was even 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And the Atlantis experience is probably the best museum experience of a spacecraft I have ever been to.
My goodness.
Has panache. It is a presentation and a real experience. And in fact, I upgraded temporarily in honor of their just amazing job of presenting Atlantis. I've temporarily upgraded my baseball cap from a Mach 30 cap to an Atlantis commemorative cap from the Atlantis experience.
Wow, good for you.
So
that's great.
I encourage you to go check it out if you've got an opportunity to.
I was there in 2012 for the first SpaceX. The Dragon launch, the one, the CRS.
The first
CRS-23, the first docking. I went down to Florida for that launch, and that was when I went to the Kennedy Space Center, and I was very impressed. They were building out that Atlantis exhibition at that point. It wasn't open yet. So to continue with this today, there was these are all things somebody from the U.S. Department of Commerce talking about deep dive supply chain assessment. Here we go.
That's a little dry for this conference.
Yeah. Well, these are things that I missed in favor of conversations, and I'm just seeing now there was in fact something on export control reform. Ronaldo Garcia, senior engineer, Office of National Security and Technology Transfer Control. So that's something we haven't seen before. This is talking about the rules that were written, the final rules that were written for dual-use satellites, and that stuff that we know about. So I don't know what happened with that. I was having conversations with other people outside, and then Andrew Nelson gave a presentation. Andrew Nelson from XCorp, and then I came back in for this next one, which was the discussion of venture capitalists and their investments in the space industry, and this was chaired by Wayne Hale, and there were 3 panelists. Peter Platzer, who is Chief Executive Officer of something called Spire, and I know I've heard him talk before, but I guess he's a VC guy. Stephen Recchi, who is like heads an angel investment group, and then Tim Ingersoll, head of Skybox Imaging again. And what was interesting, so they were talking about getting funding and venture capital and all these kinds of questions about investment and fundraising. But what I found very interesting about that, in contrast to say the space investment summits that used to be run concurrently with the ISDC, when I started this project 5 years ago, a very different kind of a very different environment that they were talking about. They were talking about a very different investment environment, where the fact that SpaceX has a rocket now and has has a contract and is delivering stuff and will be delivering astronauts, as will Boeing, as maybe will SNC. The Bigelow beam module will be up on ISS, and Virgin is about to fly. Xcore has a craft, all that kind of stuff. That those contracts and those that hardware, which didn't exist 5 years ago, at least some of it's there, and so there's a sense in which there's more investment interest. So there seemed like there was less anxiety about that in some ways. I don't know if that's true or not.
That's an interesting note, because Mach 30 has found out something similar, that it's easier to talk to people about donating to your cause, or venture capital, I guess, in that case, when you actually have projects or toys or hardware or smoke and flames.
Yep. Well, and also that temperature difference is a significant difference from when Mach 30 was founded. We incorporated coming up on 6 years ago, and very much in an era when VC were still deeply concerned about investing in space, because of the fallout from, I guess it was the late mid part of the X Prize and stuff, and a bunch of people that had overpromised and didn't have metal to speak of, right? They didn't have any hardware, and they were.
Are you talking about the Google Lunar X Prize?
No, I'm talking about the original X Prize in the 90s, right? Towards the late middle part of that, there were actually a lot of competitive teams that were somewhat investor funded and burned a lot of money and didn't have hardware to show for it at the end. Yeah. Right? And it was a very and it almost felt like in the 2000s, that, to me anyway, watching it from the sidelines, and then later as we incorporated, that there was a kind of investment hangover left over from the X Prize, because of all the X Prize competitors, the idea had been that even if you didn't win, you'd be teed up to do business, because you'd be partway to hardware, right, or partway to a successful design, and there would be this market that was opening up because of the success of the X Prize. And only one company manages to get any real hardware of consequence, and of course it's scaled, and they win, right? And then it takes a very long time for them to produce a business model around it. And all the other ones, they disappeared. Like, was it Kistler and the Raccoon people and 2 or 3 others, like had some serious investment money, if I recall correctly. And it was almost like the aftermath of that was a big hangover of like, we don't want to do that again. So it's interesting that the proof, the next go around this time involves a lot more real metal, real hardware, real operational stuff, nearly operational stuff, but stuff you can go see and touch. And that's what it took to bring the VC back to the table in a serious way.
Yeah. So it's a very. I think there was just a really more of a sense of confidence that and I'm very interested in this, right? Like how what produces a sense of confidence about what produces that sense of that we have reached a certain point, a certain period of time. So that was a very interesting panel for me, because I've heard, I've over the past 5 years listened to I've been to a lot of these investment and business-related kinds of conferences and panels. So that was very interesting. Then we had, Mark Sarangelo speaking about, you probably remember. In fact, he actually started off talking about the ISDC in Washington D.C. at the Air and Space Museum, where Jay, you were there, weren't you, at that?
No, I've not been to ISDC. It's on my list of ones to get to, but it's always been at a bad time for me school-wise.
So this is how the memory works, right? Like I have a very clear memory of you being there. So this was where
other conferences together, just not that one.
Yeah. So this was a conference where he was presenting. Oh my gosh, the two astronauts, Scott Carpenter and John Glenn. These two early Gemini or Mercury astronauts. Mercury, right? And presenting it in the Air and Space Museum, right? Probably the last time these two guys would appear together publicly, but in their late 80s or early 90s, right next to, like 2 meters or 3 meters away from Scott Glenn's capsule, which is there in the museum. Yeah. And so he talks about the anxiety of having spoken about that. But his point was that what really thrilled him about meeting these two guys was that they were not interested in talking about their storied careers. They wanted to know about the future. They wanted to know about his like about the Dream Chaser and what it was capable of and what his plans were. And he says just before, not long before Neil Armstrong died, Armstrong came out to Colorado to see the Dream Chaser because he was similarly interested in what was happening. And so there was this very the whole sense of the thing was very it's always future oriented, right? That's precisely what I'm interested in. But a kind of more of a sense among participants, I think, that future was cohering, which is interesting for me as I leave the research part of this project now. I came in at a time just after Obama had been elected, before the national space policy, before the first before the cancellation of Constellation, before the Augustine report. When things were very much in the doldrums, and leaving it now when this industry seems like it feels fairly confident about itself. So anyway, Mark Sarangelo is always a very inspiring speaker. You get a sense of him as being a really decent human being. He always many people in this industry talk about benefits to all humankind or all mankind. But he often talks about the specifics of what kinds of people will benefit, who will benefit, how his company incorporates or makes partnerships with companies that had this classification of being historically disadvantaged, communities who have started businesses, and so he's a very nice man, it seems. And then right after him. They had the other New Mexico senator, not Jeff Flake, but Martin Heinrich, the Democrat, who gave actually a very informed talk. He's an engineer himself, and it was, I think, quite a coup for Pat Hines to get one of the two senators of the state to come and talk in person. And he very knowledgeable about the industry. It sounded, he didn't fluff anything up. But it was a politician's speech, right? Like how great New Mexico is, which is fine. Then this was followed by the panel on commercial space, and with Matsumori, Mulholland, and Sarangelo from SpaceX Boeing and Sierra Nevada, and then ended off with Mike Simpson again, talking actually, and Mike Simpson's talk this time it was not. He did not say, well, last year I said we would have some accounting to do. What he said was, people, you've got to go and deal with orbital debris. He said we're setting more and more stuff up there. This is going to be a major problem, and someone has to come up with a plan for getting rid of all this orbital debris. So that was kind of like the final word, and then Pat gave a final goodbye, and we had a beer, and then I
There
came
you
here,
go.
and now I'm talking to you.
Awesome, awesome. So I have honestly lost track of Lori Garver in her position in NASA these days. Is she still in her deputy administrator role or not?
No, she quit. I think like a year ago now.
Because she was at she made it the last couple, I thought, but I was wondering if she had come this year. But if she's out of she's no longer in that role, I would.
No, she quit about a year ago, I think.
Okay.
I think she'd had enough. Yeah.
Okay then.
So she moved to a different industry. I think.
Oh wow.
She was really burnt out by the whole thing. Yeah, and then, you know, she was a former. She came up through the ranks of the National Space Society, right?
Yeah.
So I think that she really felt burnt out. I guess so. That must be what happened.
She was just one of those. You know, you would always expect to see her at ISPCS.
Yes. Yeah. So, you know, Bill Gerstenmaier was like the kind of famous face of NASA this year. He was supposed to be there last year, and I believe, and had to cancel because of the government shutdown. That's my memory. But like a lot of, you know, big people, Mark Sarangelo, Clay Mowry, George Sowers, Jeff Grayson, George Whitesides. I think people take this conference very seriously, and it's a really fun conference to come to.
Yeah.
As well as, you know, and a real variety in the programming. Also, real professionalization of the conference itself, insofar as their signage is much more sophisticated. The whole way they have the dais set up, you know, their table, their logo. It's a lot more. You know, it looks a lot more produced, let's say.
Yeah. Was going back to the personal side of things for a moment. Was our friend John there?
Yes, John D'Alessandro is here, and he actually sends his regards. And so is our friend Paul Freeman, the photographer.
Okay. Yeah. He was actually the last couple of years.
Yeah, and had some just amazing photographs that he showed us, and I'm really looking forward to his book coming out. It's going to be, he's got some. This is a British photographer, Greg. I don't know if you've met him.
I think once.
Yeah, he's been coming.
There was a year where we went to like multiple local restaurants with him, with the four of us.
Yeah. And you know, he's been out here for 7 years now, taking photographs, not sort of head on to space, but sort of just to the side of it, you know, looking at rockets on the side of the road, imagery, iconography, people who are involved, the kind of, you know, the businesses, the events that are growing up around it. He's taken these amazing pictures of these kids in I think it's is it the TOC High School, the Goddard High School? Maybe it's not. I think it is at TOC actually, where they have a science program, you know, like a sort of gifted or advanced students class, and they all do rocketry. And he's got these amazing pictures of these kids holding these, you know, these rockets.
Nice.
Just really, really beautiful images.
Did you say when the book is coming out?
No, I think you know, he's been timing it to sort of like many people. His time frame is tied to the time frame of Spaceship Two.
Sure. That makes sense.
And so, you know, the interest of a publisher, I think, is in part tied to that.
Sure.
So I think he wants to start acting on it now. He's been doing this for 7 years, so
Wow.
I think, you know, I resonate with that long-term fieldwork kind of thing. So he's got some very beautiful images, some very thought-provoking images of this part of the world, and the people who are involved, the people who are affected, the supporters, the opponents. He has this one image of this fellow who at one point had built his own alternative visitor center. He was called Space or Consequences. Yeah, which I think is a great name. So yeah, he's actually spent a lot of time in TOC, which is an interesting little community.
Well, it's nice to see the reminder of the human side of this. It's one of the things that we try to remember, and I don't think we yet do a good enough job. That the spacefaring civilization is more about the civilization than it is the space hardware.
Right.
We are a space hardware organization, but ultimately what we're trying to do is enable humanity to transition. And so it's nice to be reminded and to have someone point back to the human story. I like that he's looking at both sides of the story, all sides of the story.
Yeah, I mean, Virgin Galactic, as you know, so the what actually? So what's the story? So you asked me what. Now things are coming back to me, right? One of the bits of grumpiness is the that I heard expressed by multiple people in multiple ways is the fact that there still isn't the Southern Road access to the spaceport. And then, Virgin Galactic, George Whitesides from Virgin Galactic made a very explicit call for other tenants, right? But it's also the case, as we know, that they don't want a shed up in the desert right alongside their very beautiful hangar, right? So they know that they need other tenants there, but it's probably under conditions which might not be all that satisfying to people who, who I was talking to somebody. Oh, actually, the fellow who I want to talk to you about, this fellow David Wilden, who has done work with Virgin Galactic. He said they don't want it to look like an airport, which right. But the question is, well, where do these other tenants go to make it possible for Virgin Galactic to be the anchor tenant, right? It's an interesting question. If it's not along the runway, then where is it? And
if the whole Gateway to Space building is specifically for Virgin, so you'd have to find other real estate somewhere else along the runway.
Right, but they don't want. I think the point is they don't want people along the runway because there you go, Greg. That's exactly it. Okay, you want other tenants, but you don't want them where they go.
Right.
Where do you want them?
So so Paul's point, and this is an interesting, where aesthetics and politics come together. Paul's point about how photography happens from, how representation of the spaceport happens from the Virgin Galactic perspective is it's all very, the edges of the picture are sort of the limits of the Virgin Galactic brand, right? So you want to keep your brand very clearly in the frame, and so that relates obviously to the appearance of the runway. You want it to be the desert, right? Because they're selling wilderness, they're selling frontier, right? But so what's amazing about Paul's images is you sort of see past the edge of that frame, right? So past the beautiful kind of ultra-modern meets the Camino Real meets the desert meets the Paleolithic, right? That kind of temporal contrast that they built very successfully.
And that's all very staged.
Oh yes, it is. But when you look just a little bit to the right or left, if you ever gone, there's the barbed wire fences, and then there's the the kind of broken downness of Elephant Butte or TOC, so there's a real question of the management of aesthetics here as well. It's not just about real estate. It's not just about who the tenants are, but it's about aesthetics, I think, because they're selling that aesthetic.
Well, and I remember a couple years ago, Greg and I having the realization about that because, we are always on the lookout for where are the long-range plans for Mach 30 physically. Where does it eventually locate major operations as we eventually grow? And the time frame for that is still a ways off. But we pay attention when you get to go to see these places. It's hard not to ask the questions. And a couple of years ago, I remember Greg and I had we sat down after the tour and we're like, oh, this is really not going the direction. they really aren't going to be wanting the kind of thing we are. We're a little too dirty. little too hands in the in the metal and in the grease and too gritty and real. It's too, Greg, what was it? You called it staged, I think, a couple minutes ago.
Yeah. And that's their whole branding. Somebody else said something very interesting to me about I think it may have been Paul. He said that with the Virgin brand, it's all been about branding, right? You can you can say you can be given as a Virgin employee a task, go and make this happen, and you can't do that with this because it really depends on hardware that's still being developed. And so part of the analysis of this person, whoever it was I was talking to, was that Branson's come up against the reality of physics, because you can't make physics meet branding deadlines, right, or marketing deadlines. It has its own moods and temporalities.
Well, I think Feynman had some lovely quotes about that.
Oh, really?
Right, when he was talking about when he was on the Challenger panel, you can't fool Mother Nature. That she is the ultimate arbiter of the truth, or something along those lines, right?
You're talking about Richard Feynman?
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, that just reminds me of that, and that's absolutely the way Virgin runs things. I can imagine that's difficult.
Yeah. So so that was, people are expecting. I think if there's no Virgin Galactic flight by this time next year, there may be a lot more weakness.
Yeah, I'm sure.
But we'll see what happens. I won't be here next year unless something very surprising happens.
There you go. So I think we have time for one last couple of questions from each from Greg and I. And then I think we've gone. We started a little late, but we ran a little late, so I think we've used our allotted time. And so, Greg, I'm going to let you. Do you have a final question for David?
So I think, David, you've alluded to it already a little bit, but what's next for you if space conferences are coming to an end?
Well, so the anthropologist. One of the hardest things for us to do is to leave the field, because you get into a field, you make friends, you develop relationships, you develop commitments, and then you have to withdraw. And this is there's actually a whole history and politics of this in anthropology, right? What does it mean to leave the field? Who are you leaving behind? Especially when anthropologists have historically studied, small-scale societies in remote parts of the world, and which has a different kind of political implication for what I'm doing. But I've met a lot of people that I'm very fond of, including the two of you, and it's hard to do that. But nonetheless, I can't gather much more data because I will explode. And I've got now another 60, and probably by the time I get home with Spaceport America and fleshing everything out, another 80 pages of single space notes that I have to process, code, transcribe, code, analyze, add to my part, and the later data is the most important. Is the most important in a way, because this is where you know things now, right? Things fall into place. So then I have to. What that means is I have to really distance myself from gathering any more data. I have to. I'm going to still be following space news, of course, but the magazine, but news about space. And really start processing my data. I've analyzed and processed a lot of it with both myself and my research assistants. I've got a bunch of interviews I've still got to transcribe and look at, and then it's mapping out the book. And here's some breaking news for you. I've decided what I'm going to do is start a blog. And I'm going to start a blog. It's going to be a blog about three things: outer space, writing a book, and writing a book about outer space.
Nice.
Which are actually three separate things, right?
Yes.
And I think it's going to be a way to process, both to talk about some of my analysis, some of my data, to process the experience, to express anxieties about what the hell am I doing writing another bloody book? Oh my God, didn't I learn anything the last time? Like, don't write a book. and but also a way to remain in touch with people, right? Through rather than something like Facebook, or which is more general and personal, but to have something that is both personal and professional, but that is very directed about this activity of producing knowledge about people who have been, very, very generous with their time with me over the past 5 years, and from whom I've learned an enormous amount. So that's the next thing. I've just finished a paper that I've sent off to a journal, an anthropology journal, about the concept of atmosphere, and how thinking about atmosphere in anthropological terms, or thinking about the metaphorical extension of physical atmosphere to the idea of context, can give us some interesting, can open up some interesting ways of rethinking what it means to observe.
I love that's the stuff that's some of the stuff that you do, because I remember reading one of your other articles, and that you were shifting back and forth between a view of anthropology and a view of the field work you were doing, and the work in new space. That your shifting back and forth is really just it's very interesting process to go through.
Yeah, and it's, for me, the thing that this paper, this research has done, has enabled me to really think about how it challenges anthropological concepts. So I got into this field because I was interested in how people imagine the future and what it is to be human. And what I realized is the people I've worked with are actually incredibly good anthropologists. Anthropologists, I like to say, are the enemies of the natural. Right? If someone says something is natural, human nature, or it's this is the way things are, an anthropologist will go, yes, for you, but if you go. So I would say that this community is very good at denaturalizing, like anthropology is, denaturalizing Earth, denaturalizing terrestrial conditions, asking questions about what it is to be human. I think there are some ways in which this community is still blind to some of its presumptions, and that's part of, I hope, my contribution to it, by revealing some of those blind spots. And in part, I'm happy to do that because this community is also incredibly open to learning what those blind spots are, I think. I think anthropologists have a lot to learn about their own assumptions about what it is to be human from the perspective of space. And I think that's the great thing that I'm hoping my project will contribute, not just in anthropology. This is also, my blog is also a solution to my problem of, do I write one book or two? Because I'm writing the book that I really want to write is the book for my discipline, the book that will speak to what I'm trained in. But I also realize that I need to have some writing that is that will speak more to people who are outside my discipline, who are educated lay people from my perspective, and I think a blog might do that. Nice. My next writing project. I realize it's a very long answer to your question, Greg.
That's okay.
My next writing. My next writing project is, I'm going to write a paper called on gravity, on gravitational presumptions of social theory. And I'm going to accuse all social theorists of terrestrialism, and I'm going to call it the situation of gravity. And so I'm.
I like that.
Yeah.
The gravity of the situation.
Right. So I'm thinking about how do we think about gravity as a presence, right? As something that is active, as something that one could be aware of, as I think many people in the space community are, right? They feel gravity. Most people, gravity is just it's just there. It's part of what nature is. But for people who are interested in space, gravity is not necessarily natural, or 1G is not natural, right? It's a particular kind of nature, and because anthropologists are interested in the nature, what is natural, what is cultural, what the nature-culture distinction, I think gravity is a very interesting place to go to explore that.
That is. And
yeah. And so then
we live in like from a physics standpoint, we live in this ultimate irony of the amount of gravity you need to have a nice bubble of atmosphere so you can get civilization is also the exact amount of gravity that makes it just a little too difficult to get to space easily.
Right.
Like, if you go down enough where atmospheres aren't a thing, it's not really that hard to get off the planet.
Right.
But then you don't have a civilization that wants to get off the planet.
Right.
The universe has a really mean streak of irony, if you ask me.
and then you know the book. So I need to get a book contract, and but that's you know next year.
Awesome.
Well, I don't think
it's always been fascinating.
Top that. I don't think I can top Greg's question. So I'm going to leave off mine because Greg wins hands down.
Well, I did want to say to David, thank you again so much.
Absolutely.
You know, for sitting with us tonight and reviewing the ISPCS that we didn't get to go to, so we could live that vicariously, and you know, also for all your conversations throughout the ISPSs that we have gone to. I really
likewise.
Look forward to hearing your perspective on our industry. I say our industry, you know, the space industry and Mach 30's contribution to it. So.
Yeah. Well, and very happy to do that, and you know, I'm hoping to keep on hanging out with the Mach 30 people as much as I can.
I look forward to it.
I have some things to talk about with you guys that maybe we can talk about off
air, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
and let me echo Greg's thanks and a deeply personal part. First of all, for the bringing us to ISPCS. It was I struggled really. I struggled with the decision not to attend this year. The logistics simply weren't reasonable, but it was the hardest conference. I wound up not getting to go to a lot of the conferences I go to this year, and this was the hardest one to let go. And in part because of getting to see you and interacting with you and the other folks that we get to see every year at ISPCS. And this hangout brings us personally a little closer to the event.
I'm really glad we could do that.
And then professionally, I'm very glad to get to share with the Mach 30 community. This is something that's become a ritual for us to present an on-air hangout so that we can share that with our volunteers and say, hey, these are the cool things that we learned about at this conference, because this is, like you said, it's bar none one of the more future-looking, one of the more put together, and one of the most well-attended by the pillars of the community that is at the same time not standoffish. You're going to see a lot of some of these people at like AIAA Space or at New Space or ISDC, but all of them, they have a different feel. This one is much more of that community feel, and it's a little more personal, to go back to the name of the conference. So this has been a great boon both for Mach 30 and personally. And Greg, I'm glad that you were able to make it. It wouldn't be ISPCS without you joining us as well. And on that note, I'm going to sign us off. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and watching our hangout. Again, check us out at mach30.org. We are a nonprofit. We are beholden to the generous donations of time and money of our volunteers and supporters, so I'd encourage you to check out the Catalyst Club donation link in the upper right-hand corner. And of course, Greg wants me to remember to point down here somewhere is the subscribe button for YouTube, because the on-air hangout ends up on YouTube, and so most of you guys are probably going to see this via our blog or YouTube. So do that too, and follow our blog, and follow us on Twitter, and Facebook and Google+. We're in all those places. And finally, ad astra persivitatem, to the stars through community, good night.